Political breakdowns are often imagined as loud and unmistakable, marked by dramatic speeches or sudden resignations. In reality, they more often begin quietly, through subtle shifts behind closed doors, cautious statements, and moments of hesitation that signal something deeper is changing. What is unfolding now in Washington is not centered on a single policy dispute, but on a broader test of power, loyalty, and institutional limits. This story does not begin with breaking alerts or formal votes. It emerges through guarded language, delayed endorsements, and resistance that is no longer fully concealed. At the center of it is President Donald Trump, whose leadership style has long depended on personal loyalty rather than institutional consensus. And for the first time in a sustained way, that loyalty is no longer guaranteed. The immediate trigger appears to be a renewed focus by President Trump on Greenland, framed publicly through discussions of national security, trade, and strategic interests. What might otherwise have remained a rhetorical foreign policy idea has instead exposed fractures within his own party. When Republican senators and House leaders respond with caution or deflection rather than alignment, it reflects more than policy disagreement. It suggests a recalibration of political risk. House Speaker Mike Johnson has attempted to minimize the situation publicly, emphasizing stability and downplaying the significance of the president's remarks. His statements appear aimed less at shaping public opinion and more at preserving a narrow House majority, where even symbolic disruptions can have tangible consequences. In this environment, messaging becomes damage control rather than advocacy. In the Senate, the response has been more restrained but more consequential. Several Republican senators have avoided full endorsement of the president's position, choosing instead to emphasize process, constitutional limits, or the absence of immediate national security threats. These statements are measured, but they carry weight because President Trump's influence has historically relied on unified response and rapid compliance. Senators such as Rand Paul have spoken in institutional terms, noting a lack of Republican support without escalating the rhetoric. Others, including figures traditionally aligned with the party's more assertive foreign policy wing, have declined to fully commit. In Washington, hesitation itself is a signal, and it is one the White House does not miss. The underlying concern shared privately among lawmakers is not ideological, but strategic. President Trump has demonstrated repeatedly that loyalty is transactional and temporary. Past episodes have shown that political alignment does not guarantee protection, and that public support can be withdrawn without warning when it no longer serves his interests. That history is now shaping how senators assess their own exposure. What makes this moment distinct is the gradual shift from individual calculation to collective awareness. President Trump's influence has proven effective against isolated dissent, but less so when resistance is shared and informal. As coordination replaces silence, the balance of leverage begins to change. At the same time, House Republicans are confronting a separate but related challenge. With margins razor-thin, uncertainty itself becomes a liability. Each escalation, whether framed as tariffs, national security, or enforcement policy, introduces instability that affects vulnerable districts. For leadership, maintaining cohesion now competes directly with managing unpredictability from the top of the party. Taken together, these developments point to a larger transition. What appears on the surface as routine political disagreement is, beneath it, a reassessment of power. As dissent moves from private conversations into the public record, it becomes harder to contain and harder to reverse. This is not yet a public rupture, but it is no longer quiet. And in Washington, moments like this often mark the beginning of a broader shift rather than the end of a single controversy. This dynamic helps explain why House Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly sought to downplay internal tensions. Acknowledging the scope of the disagreement would force a choice between defending President Trump and protecting the institutional stability of the House, and those priorities are increasingly in conflict. Public denials in this context function as a temporary holding strategy rather than a resolution. In the Senate, the shift is more pronounced. Resistance there has not taken the form of public confrontation, but of procedural and constitutional framing. Senators have raised questions about statutory authority, the proper origin of tariff policy, the use of emergency powers, and the role of the courts. By grounding their responses in institutional language, they move the dispute onto terrain where presidential instinct and political pressure are less effective. This approach narrows the president's options. Institutional processes operate through delay, review, and constraint, limiting the impact of spectacle or escalation. As those boundaries become clearer, the scope for unilateral action contracts. In response, President Trump has returned to familiar methods of enforcing loyalty, emphasizing consequences and signaling what can happen to those who break with him. Recent history, however, has complicated the effectiveness of that strategy. Past episodes have shown that public alignment does not necessarily result in lasting political protection. That pattern has not gone unnoticed, and it has altered internal calculations. Silence within party ranks no longer indicates automatic compliance. In many cases, it reflects reassessment. At the same time, public discourse has focused on isolated controversies, while the deeper issue unfolds more slowly. What is emerging is not a single rebellion, but a gradual loss of cohesion within a governing coalition that has struggled to manage internal disagreement. This becomes especially visible in debates over immigration enforcement, where questions of authority, accountability, and institutional design are more difficult to avoid. Comments from lawmakers critical of current enforcement structures have challenged the assumption that increased funding or incremental reform alone can resolve systemic issues. That argument has placed pressure on both parties to clarify whether existing frameworks can be adjusted or whether more fundamental change is required. The debate moves beyond policy mechanics into questions of governance and oversight. The connection between these issues lies in how power is exercised and constrained. Whether in foreign policy, trade, or domestic enforcement, institutional resistance introduces limits that complicate impulse-driven decision-making. For the Senate, this resistance is expressed through hearings, statutory interpretation, and judicial review rather than public confrontation. As this process continues, its cumulative effect becomes more significant than any single episode. What was once managed through deflection increasingly produces fatigue. Political systems built on urgency and constant escalation depend on sustained attention. Procedural resistance, by contrast, operates through persistence. In both chambers, lawmakers are beginning to factor that reality into their decisions. As institutional processes advance and internal coordination increases, the balance shifts away from immediate reaction and toward longer-term calculation. That transition, more than any individual policy dispute, defines the current moment in Washington. What happens next will be determined less by individual statements and more by how institutions, lawmakers, and voters respond over time. The trajectory of this moment will test whether established limits function as intended when challenged, and whether the political system can absorb disruption without abandoning accountability. This is AV News. My name is Anderson Vance. Thank you for following our coverage. If you find value in clear, fact-based reporting, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and share this video. You can also find related reports and deeper analysis in the recommended videos we've left for you. We'll continue monitoring these developments closely and bring you updates as they unfold.